Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, December 19th, 2022. Merry early Christmas to you. I really appreciate you kicking off your week with me. I hope you had an awesome weekend, but let's get right to it. On this episode, after I guess what we call a pretty long sabbatical, I've got the fifth of a series covering the Anti-Federalist speeches of Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. This is in the summer of 1788. And today I'm covering really three major speeches. We could call them number 5 through 7, where Henry really presses the issue in support of a Bill of Rights. And oftentimes when we listen to the warnings of the Anti-Federalists, they were concerned about implied powers. Would the federal government exercise powers that were just implied? And many of those warnings were pretty prophetic. But on this one, it's the other direction. Henry was concerned about whether or not the powers reserved to the people of the several states would be implied by the nature of the document, like he was being told, or would they be expressly listed out? Anything not delegated is auto-reserved, or do you have to spell that out? Anyways, I'm going to explain that hopefully in just a moment, but first of all, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. And while we allow everyone another minute or so to get notifications to join us on these mainstream platforms for the live stream, I want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat. There's Leslie, good to see you in Southwest Missouri, Haji in Michigan, Richard Banks, Fredonia, Kansas, Dixie Strong in Bama, Tim Martin in Arizona, always good to see you as well, Tim. Lawrence Smith in West Virginia, Jonathan in North Dakota, Sharon, Patriot, Tyler B, Devil Dog, Brian in Georgia, Alan Hughes, and everyone else. I really appreciate it. I know I'm missing a few people, but I'll try to take a look at the chat a little bit later in the show, see if I can answer some questions. I should also mention that you definitely want to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I publish a blog post about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, and I will do that again today in a couple of hours. And there you're going to find all the episodes of the show, but for each individual blog post, I put not just the different platforms we're on, in case we happen to be missing from one of these mainstream ones one of these days, and you want to find out where else we are, like Rumble or Gab or Minds or all these other platforms. But also there's a show links section. And if you scroll down to the bottom of 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, there's a whole category covering all these other episodes that I've done on Patrick Henry's speeches and various other categories. But just a quick summary, Henry in all of his speeches is really warning about too much power. He's concerned that the people of the states, the people of Virginia specifically, because that's what he's talking about, and even later on in his career after the whole ratification debates near the end of his life, there was some speculation that maybe they would convince him to run for president. George Washington had suggested maybe we'll put you on the Supreme Court. But Henry vowed to never actually serve in office outside of Virginia. He was really a Virginian through and through. And his speeches were regularly and consistently warning about the new proposed government having too much power. He questioned against the language. He questioned the language like we the people versus we the states. He wanted a pure federal system. He said the choice that they were going to have before them were really going to be either liberty, when he said, the liberty was the primary object of the American Revolution, or they'd get empire. He warned against giving up rights and powers due to fear, because we know that fear is the foundation of government power, and even warned against doing that in the face of potentially imaginary dangers. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Now, over the course of the following week of what we're trying to cover here, if I can find my notes and screen that I'm trying to look at, this is starting June 12th. So he gave a series of speeches from June 12th through 17. He gave all through June, really. And here's TJ Martin now. Even though Patrick Henry had already pitched the idea of a Bill of Rights a week before, on June 12th, he pressed his argument further because he was concerned things were not spelled out clearly. There was language in there like general welfare, for example, and necessary and proper, that even if you described it in detail in law, that it would be construed in incorrect ways in the future. Certainly the Anti-Federalist Brutus warned about that as well months earlier. Here's what Henry said. He said, "I am that the dangers of this system are real, when those who have no similar interest with the people of this country are to legislate for us." He was concerned about people way far away legislating over all kinds of things for the people of Virginia. He said the tyranny of Philadelphia may be like the tyranny of George III. I believe this similitude will be incontestably proved before we conclude. Now, his concern, again, of course, was that there was going to be way too much power in the new general government. And the way that to deal with it, that Henry wanted to deal with that, was to include a Bill of Rights. But the Federalist supporters that he was debating with, whether it was people outside the state like James Wilson or Alexander Hamilton, Publius through the Federalist Papers, but others like James Madison and Henry Lee in Virginia were taking the other position. They were basically saying that a Bill of Rights wasn't needed because this new system was going to be totally opposite of every other system ever created before. And that anything not specifically delegated, expressly delegated, would be automatically reserved. So James Wilson, the great legal mind in Pennsylvania, said adding a Bill of Rights would be superfluous and absurd. Basically, why list out these things? Because there's no power delegated over this stuff in the Constitution. This is superfluous, is going to make it confusing. And in many ways, maybe that warning was correct, but Henry actually gets onto an interesting point. Well, first of all, a little bit more on James Wilson and this general argument from Dave Benner. Benner writes, in other words, the proposed Constitution only allowed the general government to exercise the powers enumerated. To restrict it from exercising powers it was never granted in the first place through a Bill of Rights was counterintuitive. And that makes sense, I think, to those of us who understand the structure of the document, but this was a new system. No one really had ever done this before. And so to just say that this was going to be the case, Henry was concerned about that. But I'll get to that in just a moment. Dave writes, to the assertion that the Constitution gave the general government powers which were not explicitly stated, James Wilson countered that, quote, everything which is not given is reserved. The document, Dave writes, did not grant by tacit implication. Tacit implication was Wilson's terms. He's saying, like, look, it isn't a document of implied powers. We did not structure it like that. We did it. They got their powers from, quote, the positive grant expressed in the instrument of the Union. Now, Henry was not buying it. No matter how many times you could tell him this was the structure of the Constitution, the proposed Constitution, he said no matter how many times you said this, he was just concerned. On June 12th, he said, we are told that all powers not given are reserved. I think that was kind of a tip of the hat to the things that James Wilson and others were saying. He said, I'm sorry to bring forth hackneyed observations, but, sir, important truths lose nothing of their validity or weight by frequency of repetition. It doesn't matter how many times you tell us that just because it's not delegated in the Constitution, the people of the states are going to have that reserved. It doesn't matter. This is not how things have been over the years. Here from T.J. Martinell. We know that Patrick Henry went into a long history lesson. He said that English history, because so many of the Federalist supporters of the Constitution were certainly citing English history as kind of examples for structure, but Henry was saying that English history proved otherwise. If you think that everything not delegated is automatically reserved, we have an example of how it actually worked out opposite. And T.J. Martinell puts it this way. Here, Patrick Henry was referencing the Petition of Right. So many people would tell us today, some of the experts, Patrick Henry was not really a good student of history, but in comparison to most people today, the dude really knew his stuff. And he's going back to kind of, well, back then, the Petition of Right in 1628, everyone knew that. I don't think any of us have ever learned about this in our own upbringing today. But this was during the reign of Charles I, which did set out some individual protections against the state, but Patrick Henry noted that those rights continued to be violated. He said, quote, the rights of the people continued to be violated till the Stuart family was banished in the year 1688. In other words, they had a list of some restrictions, and even though it was put on paper, Henry's like, well, they still did the wrong stuff until it was properly done. So Henry takes a position that I'm going to get into in a little bit more in a moment that I'm not really on board with myself, that if you just get the right words on paper, you're going to be better off. And maybe he makes a case that it makes it much more difficult. But here he goes further. This Bill of Rights in 1688 put an end to all construction and implication. For upwards of a century, the nation was involved in every kind of calamity till the Bill of Rights put an end to it all by defining the rights of the people and limiting the king's prerogative. Back to T.J. Martinell, he said, in other words, this was 1689, sorry. In other words, once a clearly defined Bill of Rights was passed in 1689, things finally improved for the liberties of the people. Now, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Henry was going back and forth with a lot of people. James Madison, quite a bit. Also, Henry Lighthorse Lee, who said under the state governments, he described how the structure of the constitutions for the states and the proposed federal government would be totally opposite. James Wilson did the same in that State House Yard speech that I was quoting through Dave Benner's article just a few minutes ago. But Henry Lee put it this way. Under the state governments, the people reserved to themselves certain enumerated rights, and that the rest were vested in their rulers. So in the state constitutions and in every other constitution ever done before, or whether written or unwritten, really, the structure was they got to do whatever they wanted to do except the stuff that was explicitly reserved. That was the process of that English Bill of Rights in 1689. Mr. Lee went on, but that in the federal government, the rulers of the people were vested with certain defined powers, and that what were not delegated to those rulers were retained by the people. So that's the process of what became the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So going further, it's the same argument really that James Madison gave us in Federalist number 45. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. This was in January of 1788. Madison continued, the former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which the last, the power of taxation, will for the most part be connected. So the powers delegated to the federal government are in the Constitution. They're few and defined. Everything else is auto-reserved. But this was a new system. Madison went on a little bit. He said the powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. That's called the police power, really. So Madison, Henry Lee, James Wilson, basically all the Federalists said that the new proposed Constitution, the Constitution for the new proposed federal government, was going to be set up under this kind of situation where expressly delegated powers, if it's not in the document, they can't do it, and everything else is reserved. But every other constitution ever done was totally opposite. And so Henry insisted, as T.J. Martinell writes, that this was novel. Okay, this may be the case, but everything else has ever done anything was going to be totally opposite. So shouldn't we really hammer this home? He said the Constitution would inevitably be construed to mean that the only limitations on the new government were those specifically mentioned. And in many ways, that's basically how they act to date. We can point fingers as to who's to blame on that. I'm not really sure. I haven't put a lot of thought into it. Well, I have, but I haven't really come down to where I feel about this or how I feel about that, whether it was the people who added the Bill of Rights that really caused the problem that we face today. And I know some people, probably like Brian McClanahan, would take that position. But then there are others who are like, well, maybe without that, it could have been much worse. Here's the beginning of Patrick Henry's speech, if I can fix my scrolling here. On June 16th, 1788, Mr. Chairman, the necessity of a Bill of Rights appears to me to be greater in this government than ever it was in any government before. I observed already, he said, that the sense of the European nations, and particularly Great Britain, is against the construction of rights being retained which are not expressly relinquished. Again, he's hammering home, like, look, if everyone else has always done it like this, and this is how we've all grown up, we've learned that this is the process, and now we're going to do something new, I'm concerned that it's going to be a problem. He goes, I repeat, all nations have adopted this construction, that all rights not expressly and unequivocally reserved to the people are impliedly and incidentally relinquished to rulers as necessarily inseparable from the delegated powers. So he's concerned about implied powers. He will cover implied powers. I'll do this in a future episode. In his later speeches, as they wrap up the convention, he's very concerned about the federal government being able to exercise implied powers. But here, even when talking about the powers reserved, He's concerned that they're only reserved by implication because it doesn't actually say it in the original proposed Constitution before they added amendments, which became the Bill of Rights. It said nothing about powers reserved to the states. It did not say that this is the limit of what the feds can do. So that's Henry on June 16th. Again, on the same date, same speech, he says, if you intend to reserve your unalienable or unalienable, however you want to put it, if you intend to reserve your unalienable rights, you must have the most express stipulation. For if implication be allowed, you are ousted of those rights. And implied powers, whether it's about which ones are delegated or which ones are reserved, were very big concern to Patrick Henry and to all the Anti-Federalists. If people with power, we have to understand how they viewed people with power and human nature. Human nature is not to be trusted. It's very corruptible. We know we are all very flawed creatures. And those with power, because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and power, as Abigail Adams and Samuel Adams and almost everybody else told us, James Madison as well, people with power ought not to be trusted because power would always seek to expand and grow. And if you give them the power of doing something by implication, we shouldn't be surprised, and I know I say that type of thing all the time, but we shouldn't be surprised where they find all kinds of implied powers or implication that will give themselves more power and control over the lives and liberties of the people. So he said, for if implication be allowed, you are ousted of those rights. And of course, we know that at the time they often used the term rights and powers interchangeably. So rights meaning individual rights, rights in the, quote, states' rights sense really meant powers of the states, which really were of the people of the states. So you will be ousted of that if it's just implied, the things that you want to reserve. He said if the people do not think it necessary to reserve them, they will be supposed to be given up. People with power will just assume that they have that power. He said it was expressly declared in our Confederation. There was a clause in the Confederation that said anything not delegated was expressly delegated was reserved. And he's like, okay, this is what every other constitution has done. This is what every other nation on earth has done, that if you want to reserve stuff, you have to spell it out. This is what we did here for years under the Articles of Confederation, and now you're abandoning this, and you're giving us general terms like general welfare and necessary and proper. Patrick Henry is very alarmed that this is going to become an empire, just like he warned about some days earlier. He said it was expressly declared in the Articles of Confederation that every right was retained by the states respectively. Again, right and power is used interchangeably there, which was not given up to the government of the United States. But there is no such thing here. You, therefore, by a natural and unavoidable implication, give up your rights/powers to the general government. And this is just how Richard Henry Lee described the purpose of a Bill of Rights when he tried to get one included before the ratification debates. He was an Anti-Federalist also from Virginia. I've made some mistakes in the past thinking that some of the debate notes from Harry Lighthorse Lee were actually Richard Henry Lee, but Richard Henry Lee was not there. He ended up actually being one of the first senators from Virginia, so he served in Congress. But here from Melancton Smith's notes of the Confederation Congress, September 27th, 1787, Richard Henry Lee tells us what the purpose of a Bill of Rights, and Patrick Henry took this same type of view. No power should be exercised but such as is expressly given, and therefore no constructive power can be exercised. To prevent this is the great use of a Bill of Rights. The whole point of a Bill of Rights is about reserving powers and reserving individual rights, keeping them away from the general or central government. Patrick Henry made the same case. This wasn't in, I don't know, I didn't list this as one of his speeches, but he had kind of some short interjections on the 15th. He said, a Bill of Rights may be summed up in a few words. I'm not sure, is this one the 15th? No, this one's also the 16th. We'll go back to the 15th in just a moment. I'll get the dates right in the show notes section when I publish that at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. He said a Bill of Rights may be summed up in a few words. What do they tell us? That our rights are reserved. He said, why not say so? Is it because it will consume too much paper? Gentlemen's reasonings against a Bill of Rights do not satisfy me. without saying which has the right side, it remains doubtful. So he is, again, very concerned. Here he is reiterating this same point that Richard Henry Lee made and what he was talking about on the 16th in a brief commentary on the day before, the 15th. Patrick Henry demanded where then was their doctrine of reserved rights. It's not listed in the Constitution. You're just telling me this is how it's going to be. And no one has ever seen a constitution like this, so how can we trust that people with power are going to read it like this in the future? And in many ways, that warning was correct. It was also correct even with the Bill of Rights added. So ultimately, we got a different thing we got to face. Patrick Henry wished for negative clauses, or he wished for negative clauses to prevent them from assuming any powers but those expressly given. So again, the whole notion of a Bill of Rights is what Thomas Jefferson called the foundation of the Constitution, that the power is not delegated, reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Or if you've got the T-shirt that I'm wearing, it's the other way around. They flipped it on its head, and they've basically redacted the sections of the 10th Amendment which say they are not authorized to do the stuff that is not expressly delegated to them. Anyways, back to T.J. Martinell's article. Patrick Henry argued further that there was no reason to not include a Bill of Rights. Thomas Jefferson was saying this in letters back and forth as well. He said, there's no reason to not do this, Mr. Madison. And he helped convince James Madison to get on board with that. And of course, we know that Madison was very influential in getting that pushed through. TJ goes on, were it put into the Constitution, it would not endanger any rights. Although the Federalists said, hey, if you list this stuff out, now they're going to start reading it totally differently because we're telling people that it's a document of delegated and reserved powers, and now you're listing this stuff that wasn't delegated in the first place. We're concerned about that. Maybe they could have just done the 9th and the 10th Amendment, and that's it. Anyways, were it put in the Constitution, it would not endanger any rights, nor potentially be construed as to deny the federal government of powers the Constitution expressly delegated. But without a Bill of Rights more extensive than the limitations, and Henry went through some discussion about the limitations that were in Article 1, Section 9, saying, well, this is kind of a Bill of Rights, but it's not really saying much. The new government would have extensive power over the people. Here he is saying the Bill of Rights will render all their laws, the want of a Bill of Rights, not having a Bill of Rights, will render all their laws, however oppressive, constitutional. So Patrick Henry was telling us they got to have this on there, got to have it. He said, I trust that gentleman on this occasion, this is on the 17th, will see the great objects of religion, liberty of the press, trial by jury, interdiction of cruel punishments, and every other sacred right secured before they agree to that paper. So he's saying we should not, and he was also saying, unlike what they did in Massachusetts under the leadership of John Hancock and Samuel Adams, we should not agree to ratify with a promise of amendments later because we may not like what they are. He did talk about in that history lesson on the English Bill of Rights that the only improvement happened not when they had just some stuff listed, but when they got it right, or pretty well done. He said, my mind will not be quieted till I see something substantial come forth in the shape of a Bill of Rights. Now, here's the irony of the situation. We know, and here's how T.J. Martinell puts it, Henry's lesson about the lack of an English Bill of Rights was actually correct. Plus, he was also right about how government would always expand and centralize power through implication. So Henry and his allies actually won the day, and they got the Bill of Rights that they demanded, including the express reservations of rights and powers in the 9th and 10th Amendments. But, and it's a huge but, and here's how T.J. Martinell puts it, but we can extract our own history lesson from Henry's era. No matter what is written down on paper, those looking to usurp power, basically steal it, and circumvent limited government powers will eventually find a way to misinterpret them. Thus, governments and their officials cannot be expected to restrict themselves. It doesn't matter what you put on paper. And that's what John Dickinson said in his Fabius Letters number 4, around the same time, I think that was April of 1788. He said, a good constitution promotes, but does not always produce a good administration. You can have the best constitution possible, and it creates an environment where it's more likely that the government is not going to violate rights, But ultimately, as Dickinson said, it was up to the supreme sovereignty of the people to keep the government in check in line with the bounds of the Constitution, whether the government likes that or not. And that's how TJ puts it. He said, fundamentally, the people must always be ready to nullify acts of tyranny when people in power refuse to abide by written guarantees. And today, that is 24/7, 365. They refuse to follow the Constitution. It doesn't matter. You don't just wave words on paper at the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the world. They're not going to follow that. And in some ways, and I probably have to look at this a little further, I'm not sure how Patrick Henry responded or how he felt about the ratification of the Bill of Rights years later. I know he was kind of bogged down in some financial troubles and was practicing law again. He was actually working directly with John Marshall. And as I mentioned earlier, he was getting offered some posts in the new federal government. So I'm not sure if he was actually cool with what they passed, saying, okay, this is good enough. And then we can say, well, Patrick Henry made a big mistake. He thought that all he had to do was get the right words on paper and would create an environment where you would have more liberty. But I don't know if that's the case. Maybe he thought it wasn't enough, or maybe he was thinking basically what TJ and I are talking about, that you want to have the best on paper possible, but at the same time, if the people don't love liberty and they don't defend it and learn how to exercise their rights, whether government wants them to or not, government will always grow. I'm not sure. Anyways, let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions. Patrick E. Kelly said, oh, this is pretty good. They understood the abuses, talking about how the founding generation, even those who supposedly were not the great students of history, they were far better students of history than we were. And Patrick says they understood the abuses that occurred in the 350 plus years of under the Magna Carta before the 1689 Bill of Rights were established. Burnin' Rubber said the founders wouldn't ratify the Constitution without a Bill of Rights because it was meant to outline and defend inherent rights. Although people like James Wilson and originally James Madison, Harry Lighthorse Lee, and many others were opposed to including a Bill of Rights. They thought it was dangerous. I should do an episode just on that at some point as well. They thought it was dangerous because, and that's why Madison came up with the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment, because they were concerned that if you tried to list out everything and you tried to make it for all time or for the future generations, you couldn't think of all the different things that it would apply to. And that's why the 9th Amendment was included, and I think that's why it ended up getting attached. But otherwise, they were very concerned that if you try to do something different, which is about delegated and reserved powers instead of the other way around, as Patrick Henry was arguing, that you would get confused and people would just expand their power anyway. So that's a very important point. I appreciate that, Patrick. And see what else. Kirk Morrison, I think, talking about Patrick Henry considering himself a Virginian first and foremost, he said, yes, and we need more politicians to refer to the people as citizens of their state. Let me see if there's anything else. Any law that restricts the right to keep and bear arms is a law designed to oppose a free society. Absolutely. Anyways, I'll look over the live chat a little bit later today. Of course, you can email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I get a lot of great ideas in the chat live and in the archive and by email for future episodes based on your feedback, suggestions, sometimes complaints about stuff that I'm maybe getting wrong. But if you want to help us get this kind of information out to more people, nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. Please don't feel obligated to join us, but it's just $2 a month. And as they devalue the currency more and more, we're going to take that dirty fiat and throw it in their face and we use every penny to stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government wants us to or not. We have to reach and teach people to do what Samuel Adams told us in 1771. All might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. Again, I appreciate you being here. I'm going to have kind of a spotty schedule through the holidays, but Merry Christmas to you. I'm almost certainly going to be here Wednesday, but probably not a couple of Fridays here, as I'm actually thinking about reworking. I got to test it out, reworking the format for the Fast Friday show just through nullification season as we're covering reports and news of nullification legislation being considered by the states. I'm not certain how that's going to go, but it's possible I'll have a new format for that right at the beginning of the new year. But either way, I really appreciate being here. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Hope to see you in the meantime. Otherwise, I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.